Just recording it. Okay, thank you, Mahabodhi. It's good that you've got your finger on the pulse of the record button there. Thanks, that's really helpful. Okay, so what I want to do this morning then is, is talk a little bit about how the sutra lands with us. But before I do that, I want to just draw out some points from Sagramati's presentation on Monday and then Tejananda's workshops yesterday and Tuesday. Because I think at this stage in the retreat, hopefully that is really helpful for you. And this is what, this is what is really important to me, that this session is helpful for you. So with Sagramati, we saw, these are sort of just threads. It's in no way some exhaustive summary. So if you've not been at the previous talks, I would strongly encourage you to access those. So I'm not attempting to summarize the three sessions, but I'm just drawing out some threads. So with Sagramati, we heard that the Heart Sutra has a complex history. It's a composite text. It's got quite complex origins. We kind of know, I think, reasonably certainly, that it was a Chinese text originally, which was then back translated later into Sanskrit. It's also often viewed these days as a dharani, or some kind of formula, spiritual formula. Sagramati was also talking about the nature of experience that is pointed to in the Heart Sutra. That yes, we have experience, but it's impermanent, and that's obviously something that we're very familiar with in our practice. So I think one thing that's really important about the sutra is it's not saying that we don't exist or that our faculties don't exist, but they just exist impermanently. Another key point I think that Sagramati made was that emptiness is not really emptiness in the sense of that sort of abstract noun, but it's dependent arising. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And that I think this term emptiness encourages us to see emptiness as a thing, and emptiness is not a thing. It's a process. Yes, it's a way of being. And I think Analayo talks about the early suttas as actually containing quite very few references to emptiness as an abstract noun, and more in terms of things being empty, and that present participle being empty is really key there. It's a flow, it's a process. And so because emptiness is not a thing, it's a process, we're also moving beyond nihilism. It's not nihilism, and it's not eternalism. And I'm going to be saying more about those particular filters a bit later on. And an example that he gave was from Tsongkhapa, that a seed exists, but on dependence upon conditions. Okay, so moving then to Tejananda. So both of Tejananda's sessions were practical sessions, and I personally found them really helpful. I hope you did too. And he was encouraging us to look at what is here. Look at what is here. What are we adding on? So this is our meditation practice as a process of investigation, an investigation of mental states. And he talked about how we project a personality view onto the skandhas to create self. And likewise with Sagaramaty, he said that the sutra is not about metaphysics. So it's not some grand metaphysical statement. The Buddha, as we know, was not interested in metaphysics. And he was also not asserting that there's a self or no self. We also came across this, what I thought was a really useful phrase, the 5 skandhas of grasping. The 5 skandhas of grasping. And that grasping, attachment, is present through all of those skandhas. Tejananda talked about how mostly we are aware beings. And he gave this, probably, I think he said himself, quite slightly arbitrary figure of 99% awareness and 1% self-view. I think these are to be held lightly as figures. Maybe some days I feel like I'm 50% self-view, or maybe 99% self-view and 1% awareness, but it changes, doesn't it? Yes, and this 1%, or whatever it is, of self-view is vijnana. It's dualistic consciousness, which creates the dualistic world of self and other. And he also referred to the self as drama, as a bit like our own personal soap opera. And the sense that when we investigate our experience, which, takes practice and it takes time, and that, I would thoroughly recommend that you do go on retreat with Tejananda to get more of a flavor of his methods, and that there's no kind of master or mistress controller that exists, that we have a sort of operative agency. So it does mean that we can go to the cafe to get a cup of coffee, fortunately this morning. Fortunately for all of you, I'm caffeinated. So we can do that. We have agency, but not in the way that we think. It's not this kind of dense, controlling agency. It's a light, operative agency. And he suggested that what's helpful is to look at our core beliefs, our views and our preferences and our habits. So it's an awareness raising exercise, isn't it? And these were the practices that we were doing in sessions, I think. Because of course, once we are aware of these things, of these views and preferences and habits, we can disidentify with them. We can disidentify with them. I'm not sure, I think that is a word, disidentify, or stop identifying with them, yeah. And of course, when we start to stop identifying with them, then we have a route out of secondary suffering. And it seems to me that that is what the sutra is trying to help us towards. And I think that the Heart Sutra, as with other perfection of wisdom teachings, their purpose is to blast the conceptual mind, is to crack open the conceptual mind. So they're a bit like dharmic sticks of dynamite. And the idea is that they shake us awake, but with the greatest compassion imaginable. And I think this is quite strong medicine, actually. It certainly brought down the Northern Quarter this morning. And these are profound teachings on this process of emptiness, this process of being empty. And it tells us that Buddhist teachings are only provisional, they're only relative. And we're familiar, of course, with the notion of the teaching as a raft, because ultimately there's no teaching and no attainment, as the sutra says. So our intellectual understanding, which is helpful, but only up to a certain point. And language itself, these are fragile signposts that only point the way. So I want to have say a little bit about language now and this kind of conceptualism. So as Ashvaghosha, the 2nd century philosopher and poet, says, we use words to get free from words until we reach the pure wordless essence. We use words to get free from words until we reach the pure wordless essence. So we can use words, we can use concepts, but with caution, to point the way, but not fix the way. And when I have mentioned to some people that I was doing this talk, somebody mentioned to me, oh, well, you could just hold a flower up. You don't need to talk about the Heart Sutra, you could just hold the flower up. And I did consider that briefly, but I thought it might be a little bit more helpful to say something, so I've chosen to speak. But it is, of course, a teaching from the scriptures that the Buddha, of course, held a flower up, and Mahakashpya got it. And so I think, this notion of emptiness is not something that we talk about a lot. It's something we open to. We're opening to this being empty. And I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about language, because I think that one of the reasons why the Heart Sutra is so beloved, it's probably one of the most sacred teachings in Buddhism, is because, and I can't talk for others, but for myself, it's this beautiful union of form and content, yes, that there's a sort of poetry of the Heart Sutra. The language, the rhythms of the language are beautiful. And the words are used very poetically, and they point the way to something. And the way that they point is to this teaching of conditioned co-production, praticca samutpada. So this is a very sort of, in a sense, the form and the content come together to create this. And I think this poetic language, of course, the importance of poetic language is that poetry works on multiple levels. So poetic language is not aiming to fix things, but it's aiming to open up the play of language to, I would suggest, to the play of conditionality. Of course, this wouldn't be helpful if our TV manual was written in poetry, because we need to know how the TV works. So their language needs to fix things. But in poetry, and particularly in the Buddha's teachings, the words are used poetically to point the way, but not to fix the way. So what is it pointing to? So in a sense, this is an open question. And this retreat, this urban retreat that we've gathered together to co-create this week, continually engages with that question. And it will play out in our experience over time and beyond this retreat. And I think it's probably just worth noting here that the sutra, as we've seen, is not any kind of grand metaphysical statement. And in fact, and maybe appropriately, there's quite a lot of discussion and disagreement about what the sutra says at all. Okay, so there's quite a bit of, scholarship out there on the Heart Sutra, and has been for decades, probably centuries, really, and interpretations as to what the sutra is saying are shifting all the time. So I think when Sagramati said at the beginning of the week that he wasn't he wasn't so keen to talk about the Heart Sutra, I think this is part of the problem, in a sense, that it's a little bit as though it's written on water, it's on shifting sand. But in a sense, that is its teaching, yes, that it isn't possible to fix it. And as with any, historical text and with any Dharma text, interpretations evolve over time. So I want to just make a brief reference to, there's an order member called Jayarava who's been working on the Heart Sutra for, a considerable amount of time now, and he's written extensively about it. So if the area of scholarship on the Heart Sutra is something that interests you, you can look into his publications. And I think he's publishing a book on the Heart Sutra fairly soon. And his approach to the Heart Sutra is as a method of meditation. And of course, we know that what we seem to know about the Heart Sutra is that it is a teaching given by Avalokiteshvara to Shariputra, which comes from a deep experience of meditation. And I think this teaching of emptiness is urging us to look deeply at our experience, and that it's empty of a particular delusion. And so shunyata, in this sense, can be perhaps perceived as a skillful method to get us to look at what we're experiencing when we can let go. And the kind of principal delusion, as we've seen already this week, is this delusion of vijnana, the self view, that we exist in a dualistic world of self and other, subject and object, which we assume to have intrinsic and continuing identity. And it's a kind of hallucination, in a sense. Again, we had this term, a soap opera, a drama, or a hallucination produced by this divided awareness. And then, of course, it creates its own world of form and interpretations. And this happens because our heart minds are sort of beset with mental afflictions and certain wrong views. And as we know, these produce emotional filters and habits and patterns that Tejananda was encouraging us to investigate. Habits and patterns in our body, in our minds, and then we identify with these patterns. And that means that we tend to chase after the pleasurable and the familiar and push away the unsatisfactory and the unfamiliar. We'll be familiar with the center of the wheel of life. Yeah? The greed, hatred, and delusion at the center of the wheel of life that keeps the show on the road. So trying to control life, which we can't, we look for permanence, stability, and satisfaction, but in a world of flow and changing conditions. Conditions that we can't control. So the Heart Sutra tells us that when we practice, when we investigate, all things are by nature void. They're not born or destroyed. But more importantly, we're already part of this emptiness. We are already part of these 5 skandhas. So we can't step out of life. We can't step out of conditions. So there's no vantage point. There's no vantage point from which we can view these conditions to manage them, because we're always already part of them. So it's a bit like suddenly realizing that we're a fish swimming in the ocean, rather than us thinking that we are the ocean and we can control everything in it. We're already in it. We're already caught up in the flow of the conditions. And I think we can get this, like a flash intellectually. Probably got it in the first week you came to the Buddhist Center. But what's so much more difficult, which is why we're practicing, it's a practice, not an arrival, not a destination, is that we need to get it at a deeper and emotional level. We need a deeper and emotional understanding of emptiness in our direct experience. So as Sangharakshita has said, we need to find emotional equivalents for our intellectual understanding of the Dharma. So we need to practice, take the deep dive into our experience to really see what is there. Otherwise, we stay in our heads, we stay in the conceptual world, which is, somewhere else. So I think with all of this, there's, there is a sort of emotional and existential shock. That's what the perfection of wisdom teachings are all about. And I think moving into sort of how the sutra might land with us. I don't know how it will land with you personally. But I just want to talk a little bit about nihilism and eternalism. Because I think these are, they can be quite dominating filters over our experience. And it's really good to just become more and more aware of the tendencies of our minds. And I think that these nihilistic or eternalistic tendencies will very much filter how we receive the Heart Sutra, how it plays out for us. So I talk a little bit about nihilism, which is quite easy for me because I've been a card-carrying member of the Nihilists Club for quite a long time. You have to dress in black, look very mysterious, and look quite miserable. Anyway, sort of trying to give that up now for quite a while. But I think nihilism is very prevalent in our culture. We've got a strongly materialistic culture, capitalistic culture, a commodifying culture, a secular culture. And yeah, it is quite nihilistic. It's very debilitating, of course, spiritually, because it shuts off the possibility of spiritual progress and our higher potential. And it can shut our practice down because it encourages us to crave instant gratification, getting your kicks. I was going to say something vulgar then, which I probably shouldn't do. But as the Doors used to say, getting your kicks before the whole bleep goes up in flames. So it's all a bit sort of glass half empty, the sort of nihilistic perspective. So it obviously tends towards the negative and sort of expects the bad stuff to happen. So whatever's going on, it will see things through that filter. So yeah, the nihilistic perspective tends to focus on endings, on downsides. And of course, if you're a nihilist, you're never disappointed because, you saw it all coming. And then you have to be really careful not to get smug about that. Because you might not be able to get smug because it might not happen. Anyway, but the thing to remember, as was pointed out to me many years ago, when I was on the transcendental retreat at Tiratnaloka, that nihilism is a filter. Nihilism is a filter over our experience. So it's a bit like wearing dark glasses in relation to reality. Alternatively, I'll say a little bit about eternalism, because probably, we all swing one way and the other between nihilism and eternalism. So eternalism sees things as continuing in time. So it's the fixed self, it's the enduring self. And it tends to fix experience and people as being like that. So there is an essential me and you, and things are not substantially capable of change. And it is a bit of a fantasy position because, again, it glosses over the present situation and speculates on an unknown future. And I think we can see it as the kind of pink sunglasses filter on reality, if that works for you. Yeah? And these filters, sort of stay on. They can be taken off, but they tend to be the filters through which we see things. And of course, dharmically, both tendencies are wrong views, because they're filters over experience and denying the the actual experience of the present moment. So the sutra, I think, is offering us the opportunity to withdraw our attention from that filtering process. So I think if you're a nihilist, in response to the sutra, you're going to be triggered by the term emptiness. It's always useful to notice how these terms land with us. I think when I first came across the Heart Sutra, I did experience a bit of glee at the term emptiness. Yes, and I like a metaphysical statement, so I did have a bit of delight, really, at the term. But I think the nihilist is probably going to say, "Ah, yes, emptiness, lovely. Told you so. Everything is pointless," and the Buddha says so. So there. Yeah, and there might be a bit of satisfaction derived from that. Whereas an eternalist might just say, "Oh, lighten up, yeah," and gloss over the deeper message of the sutra. But I think both of those tendencies are tendencies that will keep the ego project alive. They're both trying to stabilize the shock of the sutra, stabilize the shock of the teaching. Whereas the Heart Sutra tells us that we are open potential. I think it's worth mentioning, though, that in some versions of the Heart Sutra, the term emptiness isn't mentioned at all. And if you like detail, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 25,000 lines, which we didn't choose for this week, doesn't use the term emptiness. So it might be helpful, and tomorrow Mahashwada and I will be offering some suggestions with how to work with the sutra in our practice. But it might be helpful to think in terms of openness, of flow, of interconnection, of process, so that it goes, all things are by nature interconnected. I think this sounds much less nihilistic. Nagarjuna, the founder of the Perfection of Wisdom school, said that emptiness is a provisional term for the mutuality of being. I'll say that again. Emptiness is a provisional term for the mutuality of being. That's Nagarjuna, the founder of the Perfection of Wisdom school. And elsewhere, in one of my favorite texts, the Ratnaguna Samchayagata, which is not easy to say, talks of boundlessness. The Ratnaguna Samchayagata talks of boundlessness rather than emptiness. So the Perfection of Wisdom literature is concerned, as we've seen, to dismantle these mental abstractions, this thinking. So I think, so to speak, the message might be to hold the spirit of the sutra and not the letter. But the Heart Sutra is pointing towards an experience. So I think emptiness is in a sense, it's skillful means. It's a strategic device, really. We don't need emptiness if there's no form. So emptiness is a process, a method to see through the delusion of self and other to this open space of connection, the open space of metta, of love, loving kindness. So I'm going to make a few suggestions. Got a little bit more time, of how we can ground ourselves in this approach. So I think the first thing is sitting with the play of our experience. I think we were doing this a little bit in the workshops with Tejanandan. Just sitting with the flow of our experience. And noticing the gaps between the fabrications of the mind. And if you're familiar with the wheel of life, you'll know that there are gaps on the wheel of life. So we have contact or sparsha, and then we have vedana or sense evaluation, and then we have interpretation. And we have the movement of the mind towards craving, ignorance, or aversion. So I think we're not denying the mind, or we're not sort of restricting the mind, but I think the sutra is encouraging us to unlock that potential of the mind. And to withdraw our attention from investing in where the mind will go. And of course, we do this regularly from a certain point of view, where we do get these experiences in meditation, where I think we're often having these experiences. We're meditating, for example, in what is often a noisy shrine room in the Northern Quarter, but we manage to. Yes, so we do manage to do this. We can do this. So we're training ourselves not to follow the next disturbance of our minds. And I also think that, and we'll probably talk about this more as on the retreat, that both gratitude shifts our behavior, opening to gratitude, opening to our debt towards others, that we're interconnected beings. It might be over the net at the moment, might be with people here in the shrine room, and we have gratitude to, all of the people that have made this possible. Yeah, everything that we are involved in our lives, all the people that we rely on actually to make these things possible for us, whether it's the tech team here at NBC that have given up their time to offer this retreat for all of us, or whatever it is. And also devotional practice. I think devotional practice shifts us out of conceptual mind. It allows us to cultivate receptivity to what is beyond us, beyond our ego project. And then we become more and more attuned to our potential, that we're flowing processes of energy, and light, opening into the play of conditions. And I want to end with the words of Atisha, who's an 11th century Indian Buddhist teacher who was responsible for the spread of Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings in Asia. And he was asked what the final goal of Buddhist teaching was. And he replied that it was the essence of voidness and compassion, or the Shunyata Karuna Garbha, the essence of voidness and compassion. So he says, when you fully realize the meaning of voidness, your body, speech, and mind react with pleasure. It is like solitary, heroic medicine, for all the path is included in that realization. Okay. Well, thank you for listening and tuning in this morning. So we're going to have a short break now for 10 minutes. Come back at, I make it 16, if we come back at 26, and then we'll have a reflection activity. Okay.
Thanks, Dharmakarunya.
A two-part reflection on shunyata. So the reason that we're doing this is that reflective activity helps us engage our hearts and our minds more fully into this kind of process. And, light meditation helps us And we're going to start with just a little body awareness to ground ourselves in our bodies. So we're tuning in to our felt sense of what is happening now. Tuning in to our felt sense of what is happening now. So our contact with the floor, with the seat, and noticing what's happening in our bodies, just scanning through, starting with our feet. Just taking a few minutes to scan through. And if there are areas where you know you hold particular tension in your body, like the gut or the stomach, or maybe your back, offering some kindly awareness to this area. And tuning into the heart area. The upper torso. Dropping our shoulders. See if we can have a sense of the energy flowing freely in our body. What we're aiming for here is just a relaxed awareness, grounded in the body. And I'd like you to cast your mind to a situation that's happened in the last few days when you were very engaged with something, maybe agitated about it, some difficulty, maybe a disagreement, problem at work. Any kind of issue with somebody you live with. And see, when you're recalling this, if you could just feel your way into it. So recalling it in your mind, but also in your body. How did it feel? Can you feel any trace of it still? How was it in your mind? Your level of agitation? Was there maybe irritation? Was there any blame? See if we can get a sense of this in our memory. Just holding that for a few moments as you bring it to mind. Okay, just let the experience fade away now. No need to remember it or imagine it anymore. And now we'll just sit with the play of our present experience. And if you're having any difficulty letting go of the memory, see if you can ground yourself in the body. Go back to the body, which is always here and now. So continuing with the flow of our present experience now. I'd like to invite you now to reflect upon the memory that you brought to mind a few minutes ago. How is that now? Does it matter? Has your perspective changed at all? Okay. So the second part of what we're going to do is similar, but this time we're going to bring to mind a situation that happened some years ago. So something that you found tricky that happened some years ago. And nothing too major, but some difficulty that you remember having. Again, using imagination to perhaps recall the place where you were, the people that you were with, any sights and sounds associated with the memory. Again, are there any sort of, can you have any sort of sense of it in your body? What kind of mental activity is associated with it? So we don't want to ruminate over it or dwell on it too much. Just evoke it in your mind. Okay, and now gently let the practice go and sit with your present moment experience. So withdrawing your attention from that memory, and sitting with present moment experience. It may help to ground it in the body, because the body is now. So I'd like to invite you just to reflect on how that experience some years ago is for you now. Does it matter? So much. Has your perspective altered?